The deployment of South African troops to East Africa in 1940 paved the way for the country's military entrance into the Second World War, with its operations in Italian Somaliland and Abyssinia representing its first experience of regular warfare since the Great War a generation earlier. The Springboks War against Benito Mussolini's regime is the subject of this podcast, in which the role of climate, topography, race, and the politics of fascism and anti-fascism, both in East Africa and on the home front in the Union of South Africa, will be discussed in this edition of Historiotherapy.
Guiding us through these and other related topics will be Evert Kleynhans, an associate professor in the Department of Military History in the Faculty of Military Science at Stellenbosch University. He delivers annual guest lectures in the Department of War Studies at the École Spéciale Militaire. Oh, goodness, Evert, am I pronouncing this very French, long French name? Saint-Cyr, France. Yes. Shows you who never took French. And holds an honorary research position at the Center for War and Diplomacy at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. His recent co-edited book publications include Homefront, South Africa and the Second World War, the Second World War in East Africa, 1940 to 1941, and the Handbook of African Defense and Armed Forces. Quite an impressive list. So, Evert, we would love to jump straight into this, given that we have now captured an expert. What were the factors that sparked your interest in the history of South Africa's involvement in East Africa during World War II as a focus of your Master of Military Science degree at the Faculty of Military Science at the University of Stellenbosch?
Thank you, Thula and Lindie, for the opportunity. It's great to be talking to you. So my story with East Africa goes back to about, I think the end of 2011, when I was starting to look for a master's topic. And I don't know if it's like that with everybody, but my master's topic initially was very, very broad. My supervisors wanted me to look at the development of armor in the Union Defense Force from like the First World War until South Africa left the Commonwealth, and maybe as if it was interesting for them, I didn't find it as interesting. So eventually I narrowed it down, and I decided, well, I'd focused on East Africa because it was the first deployment for South Africa in the Second World War, and it was also the first occasion where South Africa would really use armor in warfare. So that sort of started this wonderful journey. I think it's good if one can call, with hindsight, that you see your masters as being a wonderful journey. But I was very fortunate to have worked at the military archives as a young officer, as a historian. That was great because I had unlimited access to the archive, and I could just draw boxes and files as I pleased, and I would have them in my office. And I had a lovely boss who, once I had done my official work for the day, I could just spend my time working on my thesis. So it really was amazing. I don't think I've ever had that opportunity again in my life to spend so much time just researching a topic. So yeah, East Africa has been with me for the last 14 years, and we'll talk a little bit about it later on, but it's still a neglected aspect in our historiography. So, there's just so much room still for master's degrees, for PhDs, for articles, for book chapters. The field is wide open, and I just keep, sort of returning to it and just trying something new, something different each and every time.
Thanks very much for that. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the long-term evolution of South Africa's armed forces? Basically, when are they founded, and what is their background development which leads them up until the Second World War?
Thula, yeah, it's a good one. So the Department of Defense was founded in 1912, and in the first 2 years of the Defense Force before the outbreak of the First World War, it really was bringing all of these diverse entities together: Cape Colonial, former Boer Republican forces, Natal Colonial forces. Everything had to come together into this melting pot, and I mean, it was not always a successful. It was an experiment. Whether it was successful was obviously debatable, because When South Africa entered the First World War, we have the Afrikaner Rebellion, and that would almost be, apart from a small internal deployment to quell some industrial trouble, the Afrikaner Rebellion and the campaign in German Southwest Africa was really the first test of the Defence Force. And it was a trial and error period, I think, for a large part of it. The Afrikaner Rebellion really tested the operational resolve of the Defence Force, having to deploy internally against your own people as well. So shortly after the South African War, that was still quite fresh in the people's memories. And then once that was sort of dealt with, the focus could then go to German Southwest Africa, Namibia today, and under the leadership of Louis Botha and Jan Smith. It was actually a relatively successful campaign, very harsh climate, topography, as we'll talk about later, in East Africa as well. But Namibia was very, very difficult to operate in. And the South Africans had an overwhelming force there against a relatively small German force, but they were relatively successful. That would then lead to a deployment to East Africa in late 1915, early 1916 under Jan Smith. Of course, very different, a much more resolute enemy under von Lettow-Vorbeck. And Smith was very successful with the South Africans, but it was a very costly campaign in terms of health and hygiene, not so much just combat, but what tested the South Africans, and they were there until the end of the war. And then, of course, what I think most people really know about the South Africans, or the collective memory of the war, is the deployment to France and Flanders, the Battle of Delville Wood, various other actions fought on the Western Front, the sinking of the Lindie, and then finally South Africa, sort of the Cape Corps, had the big Battle of Square Hill in Palestine. And then, like all other militaries or defense forces in the world, the interwar period was one that really tested the defense force. The defense budgets were cut. There was a revulsion in war. They had to sort of go back to the drawing board, figure out the organization. There was rationalization. It was not a happy period. And I don't think if any other department in the civil service, I think everybody suffered. But the defense force, from this big war fighting machine at the end of the First World War, really got dwindled down to something really negligible. And the defense force was mainly used in internal policing. So the Rand Revolt, the Bornel-Swartz Rebellion, the Rehoboth Rebellion, the defense force was basically an instrument of state security or internal policing. So the interesting uptick was after 1933, when Oswald Pirow came in as the Minister of Defence, and all of a sudden things started going better in the Defence Force. The budget increased, personnel increased, there was some innovation taking place. The Air Force benefited quite a bit, the Navy as well, but the Army, I'm a landlubber, but the Army was not in a good position just on the eve of the Second World War. So it was a bit of a mixed bag. I think we had some good First World War experiences, but the interwar period really, a lot of it was lost. A lot of that innovation and critical thinking about where defense should be going. So it was a mixed bag.
Just to follow up on that, I find it fascinating that you're pointing out to a pattern of almost demilitarization or cutting defense budgets after a significant war, because currently Europe is grappling with the same issue. But I also find it very interesting that you point to Oswald Pirow in 1933, and that is a time when the defense force starts organizing itself so well, because that's when Hitler is building up Germany. And yes, there were some visits by Oswald Pirow to Germany. Has there ever been any global links or comparisons to the fact that South Africa is building up a military at the same time that the rest of the world is beginning to do so?
It's a good question. I think South Africa was following suit in the rest of the Commonwealth. I think most of the Commonwealth or the Dominion armed forces were doing the same thing. So I think they saw the rise of fascism as a threat. They also, if you interrogate the primary sources, they also start thinking about the possibility of Germany or Italy becoming aggressive in Africa. So the threat perception was always geared to maybe if a continental power like France or Belgium or something would make war, it could possibly invade South Africa, or naval forces would attack the country. But from about the mid-1930s onwards, the idea of Germany and Italy becoming possible belligerents in a future war becomes a real problem. And it is something that the General Staff actually say that this is a problem, because Pirow does not tell them, listen here, guys, you have to prepare for a possible war against Germany or Italy. So they say, well, we can't prepare adequately for a war if you don't tell us who our future adversaries would be. So up until sort of the eve of the Second World War, they don't have that strategic direction. They want to innovate, they want to change, they want to start preparing, but they don't have the political leadership or the resolve, at least from within the ruling party. I think Herzog with his policy of neutrality, Smuts as well, but then also Pirow, for whichever reasons, he doesn't give them that guidance.
So Pirow is well known as a character who was leaning in the fascist direction. And in the 1940s, actually formed a split organization called the New Order, which was essentially fascist. So it doesn't surprise me at all if he wasn't giving that kind of direction. But that actually brings us to the important question in terms of South Africa's entry into the Second World War. If you could talk to that, and then why, again, deployment in East Africa.
So, I mean, I'm not going into too much details about how South Africa joined the war, but you obviously had the two different camps. You had Herzog and the whole neutrality camp that didn't want to get involved in any sort of future European conflict. And then you had and the more, I don't know if you can, the loyal to the Commonwealth, loyal to the Crown, who wanted to actively participate in the war. And we know it came out to a vote in Parliament, and they won. There was a motion, well, Herzog resigned, and Smith was asked to form a new government, and then all of a sudden, everything starts gearing up. The Department of Defense is almost overhauled. Smith brings in his, I'd like to call him his like ring of support, or those trusted sort of lieutenants that he has around him. He brings in Major General Collier to write a very critical report on the state of the Defence Force and what needs to be done to bring it up to war footing. So from September 1939 until about mid-1940, South Africa undergoes quite a rapid transformation. So you can imagine it's an aging defence force. There was not much that had happened in the interwar period, especially the army was in a bad state from the artillery guns. So it was not a good place. So they managed to start turning it around, and then of course the threat now in Africa was Italy. It had not yet joined the war. I mean, in June 1940 it did, but South Africa was now starting to think that this would be their potential adversary. It was actually, I think it was already indicated as much. So there's two very good primary documents in the archive that actually, it's two intelligence reports on East Africa and possible war with Italy, where they sketch out the entire theater, the threat scenarios, the forces, whatever they've got, and possible forms of action that would be taken. So Smuts was very adamant that South Africa should play an active part in the war, and he constantly tried to secure an active role for the South Africans. So very early on, he already offered South African troops for the British to help protect British East Africa, Kenya specifically. Initially, the British said, no, it's not needed. But and I think from about March or April 1940, just before the Italians sort of joined the war effort, they eventually said, yes, please help send us troops. So the first South African unit starts moving into East Africa mid-1940. Italy joins the war, June 1940. And shortly thereafter, it launches a number of surprise attacks, 3 surprise attacks in East Africa that throws the British defense into total confusion. And the Italians managed to capture a little bit of territory. So that sort of signals the South African entry into the campaign, and the first South African division is then earmarked to deploy there. But it was a very incremental deployment. So you have certain brigades arriving at different periods, but by the end, I'd say from about October, the whole division, November, the whole division is then in country in Kenya and waiting for these big offensive operations to start in early 1941.
You mentioned the threat perception, which was contained in some of the documents which you consulted. And I just wondered, what was it? How did they estimate the Italians? How strong did they expect them to be? What was the perception of what they were going to face in East Africa?
The South Africans had an interesting, anyway, good question again, Thula. The South Africans had a interesting threat perception. They considered that if the Italians would be able to overrun East Africa, and they could capture further British territory going down the coast, then they would be able to use their long-range bombers and bomb even the Witwatersrand. So that was part of what the South Africans considered. We've got to keep it at bay and deploy forces further northward. The British were never really confident that the Italians would be able to advance as far as Nairobi. Because Kenya's got actually quite a nice natural barrier between the northern borders with Ethiopia and Somalia and sort of like the center of Kenya. It's desolate, it's barren. So there was a natural sort of defensive barrier. So I think they always considered sort of like probing attacks and like that, but they would never, I think, consider taking the whole of Kenya. It would have just been too difficult for them. But they had a lot of troops. So they had a lot of colonial, regular European troops that were deployed there. And then, of course, they had a lot of locally raised forces as well from within Ethiopia, parts of Sudan and Somalia that then fought with the Italian forces that swelled the numbers to several 100,000 troops in the theater. So it was a threat. I mean, it was a big threat at that stage in Africa.
Goodness. And then also, you mentioned the topography of Kenya, which plays a factor, but that actually brings us to East Africa. You mentioned earlier on in terms of the First World War, disease, logistics, the topography, the climate. Did that play a role again in the same way in the Second World War?
Yeah, so I think the First World War, of course, motorization and mechanization was only very limited. So it was a war of, foot slogging infantry, some mules. There was tsetse flies, so horse sickness and everything was about. So everything sort of had to be done by porters, and we of course know the legacy of that in African history. So yes, interesting again, similar sort of area, a little bit further north. Where the South Africans initially deployed, it was quite harsh desert-like climate, so almost similar to German Southwest Africa, Namibia in a way, very hot. And then when they moved into Ethiopia, of course, and into Somalia as well, it was quite diverse. It was almost 3 different areas, from a very harsh sort of semi-arid desert-like front in northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia. In Somalia, it was a coastal belt. There were some rivers. It was a bit different. And then when they moved into Ethiopia, it was mountainous, very mountainous, especially central and northern Ethiopia. So for the South Africans, by the Second World War, well, at least by 1940 and early 41, there was motorization had taken place and mechanization. So that meant motorized transport for the infantry. They could get in trucks and move about with their supplies and their rations with them. There were armored cars and there were some tanks, not like tanks as we think about it today, but some smaller tracked vehicles. But nevertheless, it was a war of movement now, far more rapid movement. And I think the East African terrain, at least in the beginning of the war, facilitated this sort of rapid maneuver type of operations. But when they then got to Ethiopia, that changed. In the mountains, you can't use armored cars. There's no flank that you can envelop somebody with. So then it became an infantry battle where the guys had to get off the trucks and actually climb up the mountains to fight, which was very difficult.
Can you give us some sense of the big arrows? And what I mean by that is, what is the grand strategy? So there's movement, there's mechanization, there's motorization, but to what end? The South Africans are on the attack. They're the ones doing the offensive. But what's the grand strategy? How are they going to win this war? I know that no plan survives first hostilities, but what was the first plan prior to hostilities?
So the South Africans, they fought as part of the East Africa forces led by the British, led by Alan Cunningham. And there was various divisions attached to this. So South Africa had the 1st Division, and then there was the 11th and the 12th African Divisions, and then there was also the forces coming at the north from the Sudan. So there was in the broader scheme strategically, there was 2 big pincers, one from the north, from Sudan, and then one from the south, sort of, and it was like this pincer to try and squeeze the Italians and see what's going to pop and where it would pop and where you would be able to destroy them. But for the South Africans, zooming in on them specifically, and this was a big point of contention for General Brink, who was the officer commanding of the division. So because the South Africans had all of this mechanization and motorization, they took away one of the South African brigades from the division and they gave it to the African divisions to give them armored cars, tanks, whatever, that type of support. So the South Africans only had 2 brigades in their division, and they had an East African brigade attached to them that basically didn't feature too much in their offensive operations. So for the South African operations, I would say there was 3 main areas. There was the advance into southern Ethiopia led by Brink and his 2nd and 5th brigades, and they fought a number of skirmishes / battles. They probably had one big battle at Mega in February 1941, but it was sort of where they would test. I think for me, that's where they tested their doctrine, sort of on the fly, under operational conditions, which is probably the worst place to do it because you're dealing with people's lives. But nevertheless, that's how it worked. So they figured out how infantry and armor and artillery and the Air Force had to work together in the sort of combined arms warfare, which David Katz explains it's like a symphony. You know, like when all the instruments play together, it's beautiful music, but let the violinist just play something wrong and then everything sort of goes away. So they were getting that harmony for the symphony in terms of fighting combined arms warfare. So that was the one part. It was only it was no more than a month and a half, those operations, and they secured another possible route of advance towards Addis Ababa. And then you had the 1st Brigade under Dan Pienaar, and they fought through Somalia and into central Ethiopia with the 11th and the 12th African divisions. And they were the ones that then actually had to do this big transition from motorized, mechanized, combined arms warfare, and as I got into Ethiopia, all of that sort of had to disappear, and they had to get the infantry off the trucks and into the mountains. And Pienaar actually writes that this was a problem. His guys had been in the trucks. For the previous month or 2 months, they basically just dismounted, fought, and they would get back on the trucks, and they were unfit. They were no longer fit enough to get off the trucks and actually climb mountains or climb hills and fight like regular infantry. So short and the sweet, that's sort of what the South Africans did.
So now what also interests me is, of course, if you think domestically, South Africa had, very particular race relations and a racial hierarchy. And then my question is, to what extent do you see that being transferred into the armed forces? But not only that, how race relations play themselves out in a war that is fought against anti-fascism, within this context of anti-fascism. How would one look at that?
And just before I answer, just if I jump in, I'm assuming this is an all-white army, right? Or is it not?
Yeah. Well, no. It's not. It's not all white. It's not all white. But it's an important point that you make. And I think if one looks at the historiography as well, it's very clear. So there's not too much written on the East Africa campaign, but what is written by white European troops. There were elements of the Native Military Corps and the non-European army services that were deployed with the division. And I was at the military archive 2 weeks ago, and I saw these files again, and it just got me thinking. Firstly about the podcast, but then also that there's nothing been written about the Native Military Corps, for example, and this we don't know anything about their deployment to East Africa. There's nothing been written, but there are war diaries and narratives and whatever on these deployments. And of course, that ties into something we can talk about later, but there's so much scope for young historians, masters or honors or masters or PhD students that wants to tackle something really unique to go do this, because we owe it to our own history to do it as well. We owe it to the military personnel, the veterans, and it will give us a much more nuanced understanding of this war, which for a large degree was a white man's war. so the race relations is interesting, because the army was, of course, the defense force was, of course, a very stratified force. Only white troops were allowed to bear arms, unlike the First World War, where the South African Cape Corps at least could also carry arms. But yes, white troops were the fighting troops. The irony was that they were basically fighting against colonial Italian troops, so black troops from Italian East Africa, whether they were Somali or Ethiopian is besides the point. They normally were officered by, the officers and the NCOs were white Italian troops. So it was only until I'd say probably the battles around Mega, some of the battles in Somalia, and then the later battles in Ethiopia, where the South Africans actually then fought against the regular Italian army, or what units were deployed to East Africa. So yes, it's a part of our history that's really never really been written up. And even if you look, I gave all of my books, otherwise I would pull them out of the shelf. But if you look at the books, they're next door to a student, who's working on his master's, by the way, on the infantry in East Africa. But you won't find many mentions about the native military corps or the non-European army services. It's one of those silences that is in the historiography, in the literature.
Hopefully you'll be able to give us a broad brush about it at the very least, in terms of giving us a foretaste of what we might find in those files. But I also want us, before we go any further, to start mapping this out. And what I mean by that is, you've mentioned the Battle of Mega twice. We've mentioned operations in Somalia and Abyssinia. You go back to my previous question, it was about what was the plan before engagements took place. I want us to have some sort of sense of how the operations involve. I mean, one of the battles which I know about is the Battle of El Wak. And just tell us more about, how does this map progress? What is the progression? What are the different phases? And what are the breaking points, points in the overall war?
So yes, to start at the beginning, I think El Wak is the best one to start with, because it's the curtain raiser. It takes place on the 16th of December 1940. I mean, there's no arguing that they obviously chose the 16th of December for many different reasons, being former Dingaan's Day, today the Day of Reconciliation. It was a curtain raiser. It was a trial and error type of a battle. The South African forces involved, it was only one of the brigades, but they had a full dress rehearsal beforehand, and then they launched their attack, which was quite successful and very interesting. We had an interview with a veteran probably about 10 or 12 years ago, where he mentioned how they sang their Zulu war cry as they sort of got up and charged at the Italians. And they also used, very interesting, they used Zulu on the radio network, because the Italians couldn't understand what was happening. So you have these white guys from Natal speaking Zulu to one another on the battlefield, which was quite interesting. But so that's an important marker, the first deployment. And for military historians like myself, we use those first battles to look at, so what was the state of affairs before the battle, and what sort of, did anything change afterwards? Did the tactics or the organization change because of the experience of the battle? And then one could probably argue that each of these deployments, so the one to southern Ethiopia, that might have had its own first battle, and Somalia, and then later on into the campaign. But for Brink and his brigades in southern Ethiopia, I think so. The first attacks are at Al Yubo and Al Sardu, which was basically water holes, and it already tells you how rough the operating terrain is, the military operating environment, because they had to go and secure water. Of course, unlike the First World War, it was no longer just for horses, but the vehicles needed water as well, and of course the soldiers needed water. So it was about capturing water sources mainly along their route of advance. And then they've managed to hit a few different little outposts, Hobok and Bano. But the biggest challenge in that area of southern Ethiopia, and the gateway to Addis Ababa, at least from the south, was this fort at Mega. Big Italian colonial fort, quite well garrisoned. And the South Africans attacked it in sort of mid to late February. It was a couple of days worth of fighting as well. Incidentally, before that, a number of South African troops were captured. there was a sudden Italian armored attack on a column. They didn't expect it. They didn't know what to do. These Italians didn't run away like in the previous weeks. They actually stood and fought. So that was quite a challenge for the South Africans. Then in Somalia with Pirow and his gang, it was about securing bridgeheads across the Juba River specifically, because if you don't have a bridgehead, you can't move. I mean, motorization and mechanization is useless if you can't get the vehicles across rivers. So it was about securing bridgeheads. What was an interesting incident, there was a false flag incident where a bunch of South African troops went out to go capture some Italians under a white flag, and then they opened fire on them. So that obviously was one of the markers as well. But moving into central and central and northern Ethiopia, I would say the three biggest battles were Kombolcha. That was the first big mountain warfare experience of the South Africans. They couldn't use the armored cars anymore. The light tanks were no good, so they had to get off their trucks and they had to fight, fix bayonets, climb hills. It was rough, tough going. And that informed their later deployments then at Desi, and the big one was Ambalagi, which was probably reminiscent of the Drakensberg, if not higher. And that was really a big challenge for the South Africans. And they fought, interestingly, for a country that had these racial stratifications even within the defense force. They fought with Indian troops, and they just sung the praises of the Indian troops, even going as far as to suggest that the South Africans needed to send officers and men to the northwestern frontier in India for training with the Indian army to hone their skills in mountain warfare. And of course, for the South Africans, mountains would be an interesting thing, because they would experience mountain warfare again in Italy about 2 or 3 years later. Very different enemy, very different terrain, but again, mountains. And I don't know whether they really translated those skills from East Africa to Italy. So those are the big markers. There's sort of, Al-Waq, the advance into the south, and then the battles going into central and northern Ethiopia.
Well, one can't help but, again, thinking of the home front, my first question is, are there numbers? How many South African soldiers were lost during this time? How was it reported on back home? And in general, what was the impact of the East German campaign on South Africa?
So, it's good questions. I don't know if I always have the right answers. The impact of the war back home, what I can tell you is that I think the government was pretty good, or the defense force, with putting a propaganda spin on it. So they had a number of journalists and reporters traveling with them that published little booklets for public consumption. They had SAPA reporters. So the war was reported on back home. Of course, that brought some immediacy to the war. And those narratives or reports that were written up were also circulated. So they definitely did write about the war, and I think it was reported on. But it's of course a great avenue for somebody to look at in more detail. I haven't really trawled the archives at all to look at it like that, but there must be some interesting stuff there.
Whilst it may have been a largely white man's war, of course, for the Abyssinian Ethiopians, it is a war of liberation. It's a war of reconquest. Everybody knows that the conquest was within living memory of practically everybody who was alive.
Yeah.
And where do the Ethiopians come in the South African archives? What are the sort of interactions with them? I'm sure there must have been a regular skirmishing all over the place, so they must have been part of the order of battle somehow.
So I'd say it's an interesting one. There is mention, sort of, the one where they really sort of connected up with one another is during the invasion of southern Ethiopia, where Brink, while he was instructed to obviously order his troops, they had to go and make contact with these, I don't even want to call them bands or groupings of Ethiopian irregulars that were helping to fight, helping the British forces now to fight against the Italian forces. So the Patriots, as they were known. So when the South Africans were at Banno and Hobok, they actually sent patrols out and they made contact. And there's some with these forces, and there's some great photos in the military museum of the South African troops, with their armored cars making contact with these Ethiopian troops. But there's definitely more, I think, to look at with that and what the contact was like. But I've got a colleague in the US, Dr. Jacob Stoyle. He did a very interesting PhD on the Ethiopian irregulars and their role in the campaign, which of course is an understudied part of the campaign, because everybody's focus was mainly just on the European forces that were deployed there, or the Indian troops, but not so much on the local Ethiopians also fighting for their independence. And like you said, everybody there had a memory of probably what life was like before the Italians came. So yeah. Well, sorry, just another point. What was interesting was when the South Africans entered Addis Ababa, when it was liberated, a lot of these Ethiopian patriots, of course, then also came towards the city, and it was difficult for the Allied forces to control them, because of course they were hell-bent on revenge and looting and claiming what was theirs. So the South African troops and probably some of the other British Commonwealth troops there then had to be deployed in a counter-insurgency role almost against the local Ethiopians, which is a bit of a dichotomy. If you think, you're helping to liberate your country, and then the next moment the guys that you were fighting with now has to sort of turn against you and try and order and police you to prevent you from going, looting and pillaging. So yeah, interesting one.
No, but it's interesting how we always have these, dichotomies, contradictions in history. But we also have patterns, and I will admit I'm interested now, given that, in recent times we've had disastrous involvement in the Congo, to put it mildly. What would you say in broad strokes throughout the 20th century in terms of the successes or the failures of South Africa's involvement north of its borders in Africa, in these kinds of military campaigns north of the Limpopo, if you want to call it that?
I think East Africa, the campaign there is important in our military history. It was sort of the first shot on the ground, the first test of the Defence Force under operational conditions, and it actually came out of the war quite well out of the campaign. It was highly successful. It didn't lose too many soldiers, not too many casualties, and it actually achieved quite a lot. It played a major role, even though I think it's sometimes overlooked within the broader historiography. I would say that the South Africans did play a very important role. The Air Force, the engineers, building roads, providing water, sort of services that were still around for many years after the war that would have benefited the local population. That sort of stuff, it's all in the archive and it's available. But of course, East Africa was quickly forgotten, because by the time the East Africa campaign was busy wrapping up, the second South African division was already being deployed to North Africa, and the first division would also join them. And we of course know by November 1941, South Africa would suffer its first big defeat at Sidi Rizay, and then in June 1942, Tobruk. And that, I think, galvanized attention, historical attention, and I think East Africa just became a bit of a sideshow that everybody quickly forgot about. And I think that's part of the reason why in the historiography not much of the focus is there. Everybody knows about Italy, everybody knows about North Africa, Madagascar, not much, but East Africa was also sort of relegated. So I think South Africa's got a good Second World War track record if we talk about just operational deployments. Relatively speaking, despite those two setbacks, they did pretty well. South Africa's contributions beyond its borders since the Second World War is, of course, I think it's a whole many different podcasts. There was, of course, what affected the Defence Force after the Second World War was, of course, the National Party coming to power in 1948, which you, Lindie, are, of course, and you, Thula, are far more, this is your area of interest. But the Defence Force under the National Party took a nosedive. So all of this experience that that was accumulated in the Second World War was basically worked out through the policy of Africanization and whatever. And then by 1975, when the South Africans invade Angola, they would have to relearn a lot of the lessons, hard lessons that would, of course, affect the Defence Force in many different ways. A lot of that knowledge that had been there before, whether it was for good or for bad, had disappeared, and the Defence Force sort of had to relearn. And then in 1994, of course, bringing the liberation movements, the South African Defence Force, the Homeland Defence Forces together, I think was, of course, it was a very successful experiment because it's still around today. There was a little bit of hiccups and bumps, but since then, South Africa has really projected force regionally to secure or to help SADC at least. Some of it would be questionable in some of the later stuff that happened. But I think it boils down to threat perceptions that we talked about earlier. If you don't know, if your country doesn't define what the real threat perceptions are that faces your country, and if your government can't pin it down to say something that, X, Y, and Z is what we deem to be our biggest threats, then it's very difficult to get a defense force geared and ready to deploy. If they don't know what they're going to meet, then how do you prepare for it? And I think that's sort of the conundrum that we face today. Yeah.
I'd like us to focus very briefly on the history and historiography in the following sense. For it to be quickly forgotten, there must have been a moment where it was remembered and it did capture attention. So within the context of the overall Second World War, that moment of the Italian Empire failing, what was its impact? What sort of fillip, however limited it was, what was that impact? And please answer that first, and then I'll go on to what I'm thinking about with regards to the broader history.
So the historiography, I think it's in the period following the war, immediately, actually during the war, the Union government created a section in the Defence Force called the Union War Histories, and their job was as official historians to record South Africa's role in the war. So it was an amazing thing. They had historians employed by the Defence Force going out, collecting eyewitness accounts and reports and writing up draft narratives. And that's all there today in the archive. It really was, it was mind-boggling how well they figured it out. So from that project, there was 3 official histories that was actually written, 2 on North Africa, 1 on the naval war in South African waters. And then it was closed down by 1961 by the National Party. It was amazing that it actually survived all the way until 1961. So they had a number of official histories planned for East Africa, for Italy, even for Madagascar, for a whole bunch of different things in the war. But those never materialized. So you find some draft, you can find some draft copies of some of these, but the rest aren't there. So after the closure of this Union War Histories, we see that it was the citizen force associations, veterans, regimental associations, they sort of drove the recording of South Africa's military history during the war to try and make up all of these sort of gaps in the literature. So there's something called South Africa. Is it called the South African World War II series or something like that? Orpen, that Neil Orpen and colleagues wrote about. So they tried to fill in the gaps, but they weren't as rigorous as what the official historians did it. They weren't all trained historians. And I think that sort of, after that, there's the brief Ashanti series where, what's his name? Al-Jay Fenter. But that was sort of written in the late 80s and early 90s, and also for dubious reasons. But that sort of marked the end of it. And I think since then, there's not been too much attention really in the historiography on this. So I think there was an uptick in like 50s, 60s, 70s, and then that was sort of maybe the heart of it, and then it went down.
Awesome.
But the great irony is, of course, as we're heading towards the centenary of the Second World War, and I don't know if you would agree with me, but I think South Africa's First World War centenary sort of came and went. There was a little bit of work done, a few studies here and there, but not much more happened. And we're now in a period where, if we are 14 years or so away from the start of the centenary, everything that we are doing now might, in 14 years' time or 15 years' time, or by the end of the war, by the end of the centenary, might actually make an impact, and might what we do now on these campaigns would be worthwhile in the next 15 or so years.
Well, let me put you on the spot there, because in the following sense, it comes down to whose war is it? In other words, who owns it? There's the idea that when, in the First World War, the Allied leaders are laying down their wreaths, that Jacob Zuma shouldn't be there because somehow it's not a South African war. I want to link it to what we left unsaid with regards to the native military corps, and just speak about the non-white involvement in this war. But then I also want to ask you, whose war is, why should we care when it comes to 2040? Why? What is the relevance? What will the relevance to a South African in 15 years' time? What will it be?
Yeah. It's a good and it's a tough question. And I think if we don't, of course, change our approach to writing up these histories of the Second World War, it will just remain what it's been always. It will be a history of white participation in the Second World War. So yes, how do you explain it to a child growing up in rural Mpumalanga or Limpopo, that why should they study the Second World War and why should they study the campaign in East Africa? And I think that is the real challenge going forward. How do you make that history accessible and part of some collective heritage? But to do that, we need to make the South African contribution to the Second World War a South African contribution and not just a white contribution. And that would be the real challenge. But I must be honest, I don't know in your departments, but in our departments, studying the Second World War is not, it's not too sexy.
But military history is going to come back. I can swear it's going to come back. I can feel it.
It's going to come back. And if you walk, well, you both know it, but if you walk into a bookshop, if you walk into bargain books or exclusive books, if you go to the history shelves, go look at war sells. It sells. So, no, I don't know. I'm not glorifying war here, but it's something that's going to be around. And if I would give advice to a younger historian who maybe wants to do it, I would say, you know what, the Second World War, if you tackle the right topic, and there's so much that's not been done, you could really make a name for yourself, really.
Well, I think the gauntlet has been thrown down, and now we have to see that the challenge is accepted. But Evert, I really want to thank you for this. I will say, not being a military historian myself, I've been very impressed with the work that you and your colleagues have been doing over the past few years in establishing this as a significant field, but also not just a growing field, but one of the best, creative, innovative fields in South African historiography. So thank you for that. I think you are actually beginning to build a narrative that was once very much neglected. And we look forward to hearing more about this. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.